So once we have the analysis out of the way and we kind of have a mental idea of what the image needs, then we're ready to proceed with the actual retouching. And as I said in the workflow steps, the first thing that we want to address is any exposure blending that you might want to do. And that's only if necessary. It's a fairly common practice to process a raw file twice. Especially with portraiture, the exposure that's necessary for the sky might be different than what's necessary for the subject. And that's really just, basic masking. So we're not going to cover that in too much detail, but if you wanted to do that, you would do that first. And again, that's really just if you're exposure blending from the same raw file. If you want to do a sky replacement or a background replacement or, any kind of advanced compositing where you're compositing more than one photograph together, then do that at the end. But if you just want to blend exposures from the same raw file, then you can do that at the beginning. Because the step that we're about to do now is the shape step, and we're going to actually be moving pixels around. So if you imagine, reshaping somebody's body or somebody's clothing, if you do that, and then later you want to, bring the sky back in from that same raw file, that shape isn't going to match anymore, and you're going to later have to try and match something that you've already moved, and it's going to be a mess. So if you have any exposure blending, get that out of the way right out of the gate. And then once that's finished, you're ready to move on to the shape work, which we'll do now. So here we are back in Photoshop. We can turn off our markup layer. And before we do anything, we want to duplicate our background layer. We want to work non-destructively in Photoshop, meaning that everything that we do can be undone in the future. And there are many ways to work non-destructively in Photoshop, and I've kind of worked out a sort of hybrid non-destructive workflow. Some people take it, in my opinion, way too far, and they're using smart objects for everything, and they want every single filter that they apply to be easily undoable. I do that a little bit, but I think it can be done in a smart way, and it can be done in a way that is a little bit overboard. So there are a few techniques that I'll show you throughout this course that do move pixels around on layers and are technically destructive to the individual layer that you might be working on. But overall, everything that we do can be undone with what's contained in the file. And there are, maybe a few retouchers out there who would argue with my methods, in some specific way. But I think that this workflow is really efficient and works well, and it keeps the files from becoming enormous. If you have, every time you duplicate your pixels, it makes your file that much bigger. So if in the end you have, 20 layers that contain the full pixels of your image, that file is going to be enormous. So I like to keep my layers as efficient as possible, but I do always want to make sure that everything I do in an image can be undone one way or another later. That's kind of the concept of working non-destructively, and it is really important. So the first thing we want to do with this image to work non-destructively is duplicate this background layer. And a nice time saver is, rather than just Command or Control J, if you add Alt or Option to it, it gives you the dialog box to rename it automatically. So again, on a Mac, that's Option Command J, and on a PC, Alt Control J. And then we're just going to call this Retouch. And now any pixels that we might move around will be done to this retouch layer, and we still have the background layer that we can go back to if we need to revert anything or undo something that we might have done to this layer. This one is still here with our original pixels contained in it. So as I've said, the first thing that we want to do is address the shape of the image. So there are many ways to do this, and we'll cover them as we go. But the kind of standard way is with the Liquify tool. And the keyboard shortcut for that is Shift, Command, or Control X. And it's also up here in the filter menu. I'm not going to cover the entire Liquify tool. You're probably already familiar with it. But basically, I just want to have a look at the edges of the image and see if anything needs to be moved around at all. So this line of her shirt on her shoulder is a little bit kind of wavy. So I might just straighten that out a little bit. It doesn't need to be perfectly straight, but it could be a little bit better. So something like that. So that's really all that this image needs. So I'm going to click OK. But there are a lot of situations where you might need to do a lot more aggressive liquefying. And it's often the case that the background gets kind of messed up when you end up pushing all of those pixels around. So I want to show you a few different techniques that you can use to reconstruct the background after you've done a bunch of liquefying. So I'm going to switch to a different image, which I have sitting on my desktop, and these are included in the downloads as well. So let's do this one here, background 1. And this is a pretty common scenario where you have a lot of straight lines that are happening behind your subject. And when you go into liquefy, those lines are going to start to get a little crooked. So I want to show you an easy way with this image to prevent that. So I'm going to create our retouch layer. And then I'm going to go into liquefy, Shift, Command or Control X. And with the warp tool, I'm going to come in here with a fairly big brush with the bracket keys on the keyboard. And then I want to just push in the line of her jeans just a little bit. I don't think the image actually particularly needs it, but we're just going to do it for the sake of demonstration. And we see when I do that, it's also moving the line of this shipping container that she's standing next to. And same thing over here. If I wanted to push this over, now this vertical line doesn't line up anymore. So that's something that you want to be really careful of when you're retouching. Don't just look at the silhouette of your subject. Look at what's happening behind them and make sure that if you are disrupting the background in this way, that you fix it later. There have been a lot of like Photoshop disasters where people liquefy in their waist and then the background behind them is just totally stretched and they get caught. So you definitely want to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. So once the liquefying is finished, then just go ahead and click OK. And with this image, there's a nice, easy way to fix this, and that's with the history brush. So I'm going to zoom in here so we see a little bit better. And history brush is Y on the keyboard, or it's right here on the toolbar. And that works with the history states. And that's one of the reasons why I like to have the history states here. And the history brush, you see it has this little icon right here. Whatever history state you set the history brush to. So in this case, it can be to the layer via copy. In this case, we haven't done anything else to this file, so this is a bit unnecessary, but there are many other situations where you might want to specifically tell the history brush where you want it to go back to. And now, when we paint with that brush, it's going to revert the pixels back to what they were before we did the liquefy filter. So we can come in here and just paint that straight edge back up. And we want to make sure that we don't go too far over, or else we're going to bring her old pant leg back. So we don't want that. But we want to just come up and paint as much of it as we can. And if we get a little bit of her pants and its old shadow there, that's okay. We'll fix that in a second. But we want to just follow that line up straight. And we also want to make sure that we put all of the pixels back. So don't just do the line, like make sure that you get all of it. And we just come down and do the whole thing. And then we can turn that layer on and off just to make sure that the line is where it's supposed to be. And we see now that we have this little bit here that we need to address. We can just do that quickly with the patch tool. That's J on the keyboard. And then just drag a selection around that and move it down here into an area with clean pixels, something like that. But I did grab this paint drip that I probably don't want to duplicate, so I'll just come in and hit that again. And then we can do the same thing over here for this curved line. So history brush Y on the keyboard, and then just come in and paint that line back down to where it's supposed to be. And you can do a mask here if you want to, but if you come in with a smaller brush and just paint down as far as you can until you start to see her pant leg again, and then we just need to get rid of those pixels. And we can do that with the stamp tool, S on the keyboard. And we want to make sure that we're sampling the current layer and that our blend mode is set to normal and that our opacity is 100. So I'm going to press 0 on the keyboard to set the opacity back to 100. And then we'll just set our source here and just bring this line down with a fairly hard brush, which you can see up here in the tool panel. So I want a fairly hard brush to get right down to the edge of her pants there, and then just stamp that down. And that's perfect. So now when we turn our retouch layer on and off, we see that her pants are moving in and out, but the straight lines are remaining nice and straight. I see this one is a little bit moving, so grab the history brush again, Y on the keyboard, and just hit that one really quick. And now that looks great. So that's one way to do it when you have straight lines behind your subject. And at this point, you might be wondering why I'm not doing the liquefy on a smart object as a smart filter. You can certainly do that, but I generally don't like to do that because it makes it so that you can't directly edit the pixels that are on that layer. So when we went in to do the history brush, for example, or the patching that we did to fix the area next to her pant leg, we can't do any of that on a smart layer because those pixels are not directly editable. And to me, it's not really worth the additional complication of having to do those things on their own layers in order to preserve the Liquify filter as a smart filter. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to delete this retouch layer so we can start from scratch. And the other way that a lot of people work with Liquify is as a smart filter on a smart object. So let me just show you that really quick. I'm going to duplicate the background layer again, and then I'm going to right click on that layer and click Convert to Smart Object. And now when we go into Liquify, I'm just going to quickly push those pixels over like that. That Liquify action is preserved as a smart filter on this layer, so we can turn that on and off. And there's certainly nothing wrong with working this way, but the problem is that you see I still have the history brush active here, and the cursor is telling us that there's going to be a problem. So if I click, it tells us that the smart object is not directly editable. And that's because Photoshop, with smart objects, it only lets us move pixels around in very specific ways. So with Liquify, for example, but not with history brush. And the patch tool wouldn't work, and things like that. So I'm just going to click OK. What we would have to do now is create a new blank layer, and then we can do our history brushing on this blank layer. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But the problem is when we try to come in and fix these pixels here with the patch tool, the patch tool doesn't really work on layers with transparency like this, because when I try to come over here to find a patch source, it doesn't really have one, and it's going to get kind of messed up. And of course, you could fix that with Stamp or Healing Brush or some other tools that work better on blank layers. But personally, I really like the patch tool, and I generally don't like being limited in the ways that working on blank layers like that are limiting, especially with the patch tool. So, and you see also here in our layer stack now we have several more layers, and then when I continue with the retouching, I'm going to have to create another layer. So to me, it's not really worth it to go through all of this complexity just to be able to preserve the ability to turn this Liquify on and off. If I ever decided that I wanted to come back and redo this Liquify in some way with the way that I showed you originally, all of the original pixels still exist here on the background layer. So if I made a mistake in this area, I can just draw a selection around that area of the background layer and just jump that to its own layer and then put it on top of the work that I had already done, and then just kind of start from scratch again. So to me, 90% of the time, I'm never going to have to redo my Liquify. The most likely scenario is that I maybe didn't do quite enough, so I can just go into Liquify again and push it over a little bit. But the additional complexity of having that Liquify on its own smart layer isn't quite worth it to me. But you have to make that determination if it is worth it for you. A lot of people do like to work that way, and I certainly don't have a problem with it. It's just for me, it's not as intuitive, and it feels a little clunky. So I just wanted to show you that it can be done that way if you prefer, and you can just make that determination for yourself. And I'm going to go ahead and just close this image. And then I'm going to grab this other background 2 image. And this one's a little bit more complicated because we're going to need to do a little bit more background reconstruction after we Liquify her. So there are a few different ways to do that. I'm going to show you a really quick and easy way that will work well in this case. We're going to duplicate our background layer, Option-Command-J, or Alt-Control-J on a PC, and call it Retouch. And then I'm going to jump into the Liquify tool. A nice shortcut with the Liquify tool is if you make a selection first. So I'm going to grab the marquee tool, M on the keyboard, and then just draw a selection of the bottom half of the image. And then enter Liquify, Shift, Command, or Control X. It'll only show you that part of the image in Liquify. So that can be nice just to save you having to zoom in. And we're not going to do any liquifying above her shoulder here, so we really only need to see this part of the image. And in this case, her t-shirt is billowing out a little bit, so we can kind of give her a little different silhouette here. So I'm going to grab the Forward Warp tool again, W on the keyboard. And with a fairly big brush, I'm just going to push the shirt in a little bit here. And I'm completely ignoring the background right now. I'm really just focused on her shape and how I want that to look. So we can round out this area here a little bit and then maybe bring this in just a touch more. Something like that. And maybe this wrinkle here on the back, we can selectively push that in a little bit and then move that whole part of the shirt in. And that, kind of gives her a nice shape overall. And maybe this little bump right here on her back we can smooth out as well. And you see here that the pixels of the brick, they do get a little bit softer with the liquify tool because they're getting moved around, so we lose some sharpness. So you just want to make sure that you fix that. I would just do it with the patch tool once we get out of liquify. Something like that. And when we're happy, we can press OK, and then Command or Control D to deselect. And now when I turn this layer on and off, you see that the bricks are kind of stretched and they look weird. The edges aren't straight anymore, and it's kind of, you can tell that they've been pushed in next to her body. So what we want to do is fix that, and we can try and do it with the stamp tool and stamp these bricks over and try and kind of manually reconstruct them in a straighter way. But Photoshop has a few tools that can kind of automate this for us that work really well in situations like this, and one of them is Content Aware Fill. So I want to create kind of a clean background layer with nice bricks that go far enough in that we don't have to worry about the edges of her. So I want to duplicate the background layer, Command or Control J, and then I want to turn off the retouch layer here. Now I want to basically just create a clean bit of background here that we can mask underneath our liquefied layer. So I'm going to do that with Content Aware Fill. So I'm going to grab the lasso tool, L on the keyboard, and just make a rough selection here along the edge of her body. Doesn't need to be super precise. And I'm going to come in about halfway and then just go back up to close that loop. And then I'm going to press Shift and Delete or Backspace on a PC. And that brings up the fill dialog. And you want to make sure that here on Contents it's set to Content Aware and hit OK. And we'll see how good it does. So we see it's actually pretty good. We don't care about this area here. We're really just concerned about this edge of brick. It's not perfect. It brought in a little bit of weirdness, and there's some issue with the edge here, but it's going to get us pretty close. So let's leave that for now. And then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to just, I can do better than that. I'm going to draw a quick line down here. And then come again about halfway up, something like that. And then Shift and Delete again with Content Aware Fill. And let's see what happens. So that looks pretty good. Again, not bad. Content Aware is pretty scary sometimes how good it works, especially on repeating patterns and architecture and things like that. It works really well. So now let's turn our retouch layer back on. And now we just need to make a quick mask on this layer. So with the Quick Mask tool, W on the keyboard, I'm just going to draw a quick selection around her body. And we want to make sure that we get it all. And then we can jump into the Select and Mask dialog here with this button, or the keyboard shortcut for that on a Mac is Option Command R, on a PC Alt Control R. And then we want to come in here and analyze our edge and just see if there's any areas that we missed. We can turn on a little bit of edge detection, maybe around 5 or 6 pixels. Should work pretty well. And then with the brush tool, B on the keyboard, I'm just going to paint over any areas that it might have missed, like those. And then just quickly scan up along that edge, and it looks pretty darn good. Missed a little spot here, so I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and just brush over that, like that. And there. That looks great. And then I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now we want to put a mask on this layer. So we're just going to click the Add Mask button there. And now we see that we have that reconstructed background that we just created is now showing underneath her. And now we know what parts of the Content Aware fill we need to repair. The reason I didn't worry about a lot of this mess in here is because I knew that most of it would be covered up by her. So now that I see what parts of it are actually revealed, I can go in and make some repairs. So we want to do that here on this background copy layer. And like this edge, for example, I can just grab that with the patch tool, that's J on the keyboard, and just patch over a new edge, maybe something like that. Looks pretty good. this little section here is kind of weird. I'll just patch that out. And the rest of it looks fine to me. Maybe this edge can be a little bit better. Something like that. And then on this side, yeah, it looks really okay, actually. Maybe this center of this brick, we don't want all this going on. We can just patch some clean brick pixels on top of that. And I see that this little dimple that we fixed didn't get included on our mask here, so I just want to select that mask again, and with white paint and the normal brush tool B on the keyboard, just reveal that part of the retouch layer again. So now we have our retouch layer and this background copy layer that we made, and we just want to make sure that we didn't miss anything. So if I turn this on and off, I see there's a little spot here that I missed. So again, on that mask, I'm just going to paint that back in. So now there are two ways to proceed. One is, if we're very confident that we like the way that the retouch and the background copy layers are interacting with each other, we can just merge them together by selecting them both and pressing Command or Control E. And then we can proceed with the retouching on this retouch layer. But if you're a little bit nervous about doing that and you want to preserve these layers as their own layers, you can do that. And then you would just create a merged copy. So on a Mac, that's Shift Option Command E. On a PC, Shift Alt Control E. And then we can rename this layer Retouch. So that kind of becomes our new retouch layer. And then I would just group these together and call this Background Fix. That will make the file bigger now because we have two additional pixel layers. One way that we can minimize our file size a little bit here is by deleting the pixels of these layers that we don't need. So if I select the layer itself and then I grab the marquee tool, M on the keyboard, and just select all of the top portion of the image here that we didn't make any changes to, then I can just press delete. And you see here on the layer icon that we now have transparency on the top half of that image, and then I can go down to the background copy layer and delete that as well. That way, everything that exists in the area that we were masking and certainly everything in the background that we were messing with is still preserved, but we've kind of thrown away all of the extra pixels that we don't need. We can even come down here a little more on this background copy layer if we want to. That's just for issues of file size. It's totally not necessary to do that, but if you want to, you can. So now we have a new merged retouch copy layer here that we can continue on working with. And there's the before and after with the nice clean background. So I'm going to close this image. So that's a little bit about shape. We'll cover some more techniques with some of the other demos that we're going to do further along. But I want to continue with the rest of the workflow steps for this image. And that will be starting to look at the skin. We'll do the rough cleanup, and then we'll move on to the skin smoothing and then the further steps. So we'll take a break here, and when we come back, we'll get into skin cleanup.